This presentation is based on two related but separate papers, and the one with this title is co-written by myself and Adrian Cherney from the School of Social Science and Brian as well. But they're both based on the same empirical data. Okay, so a question I think probably everybody in this room is interested in is, do policymakers use academic research? There's lots of reasons to ask that question. Nobody seems to really have a final answer for that yet. But the quest for the answer goes back all the way to the 1970s and maybe earlier. Back then, they called this topic research utilization. They were mostly interested in how to improve the uptake of academic research for the sake of research. And it's something that researchers in particular were interested in, and it was a question that circulated in the academic community. These days, we call it evidence-based policy, but the subject is sort of the same. We're kind of looking at it from the other side of the lens, I think. Now we're looking at how can we improve policy by getting more research into it, and it's a question that policymakers ask as frequently as academics do. This graphic, if you're interested, is these are library books, and this is the Australian Public Service Commission. Trying to get the books into the public service. What do we mean when we talk about research use? Lots of people have given multiple lists of what different kinds of use, but generally I think it can be boiled down to these three categories. So and these are ideals, so I think everybody agrees that this doesn't happen in these absolute pure forms. But basically you can think of instrumental use of research where policymakers conceive of a problem, then they go out and look for research that might help them understand the problem better, come up with a solution, and then they use the results that they found from the academic sources or from wherever and apply that to actually formulating and implementing a policy solution. Pretty much everybody agrees it doesn't ever happen like that, but that is one ideal form. Another one would be conceptual use of academic research, where research is used for general long-term enlightenment, changing paradigms, shifting ideas, big thinking, long-term planning, that kind of thing. And then the third one, political, or sometimes called symbolic, is where governments have a position they've already taken, and then they go and find research that backs up something that they already believe in, and then say, here, look, we found this research, so it must be true, it must be the right way to do it. Or they can use it for shaming the political opposition, or for a variety of other symbolic or political sources. So in the evidence-based policy literature, there's sort of one camp that believes that we can improve policy by doing more of instrumental and conceptual stuff, and that there is too much political and symbolic use of research going on at the moment. And then there's another camp that says that, well, this is sort of fundamental to the way that policy is made, and we can't really run away from it, we should sort of embrace it. And anyways, oh, there you go, I knew that was going to happen. And anyways, if we did too much of this one, especially this one, then we would end up with a technocratic rule where policy decisions are made based on what algorithms tell us we need to do, and not based on what democracy and voters tell us what should be done. So still a lot of debate in that area. There's sort of a compromise position, which this paper kind of adopts, which is that stop, you're both right. We can have we can improve the instrumental use of research and actually look at what evidence is out there and maybe apply it a little bit better to the policy that's being made and try to tone down ideology. At the same time, we can acknowledge the fact that politics and policy is about balancing resources, competition between societal groups and other kinds of interests, and those both have to be taken into account, and these are not pure ideal forms. Back in the 70s, or actually, if you go back even further to the 60s, C.P. Snow famously divided arts and sciences into what he called two separate cultures. This idea was adopted by some thinkers in the 70s, in particular Nathan Kaplan, who postulated that perhaps academia and policy also represent two cultures. He called them two communities. And this might be a good reason why research is not used as much as it could be by policymakers when they make important decisions. So, for instance, they speak different languages. Academic research is generally written in you might argue this, but this is what they thought at the time, that it was written in a more technical language, harder to understand by ordinary people, and requiring significant training before you can really understand what's being said, whereas policy should be written in everyday language. Incentives in academia were all about publishing. Policy, they're more about, I guess, career development and personal rewards. Timelines, supposedly academics operate on much longer timelines. This is the traditional interpretation. Policy is done on the moment. Philosophical motivation, we're more interested in long-term thinking and conceptualization, whereas policy is about solving problems in the here and now. And obviously allowable risk is very different. In a previous life, I was an engineer. I designed a ventilator that exploded. Fortunately, it exploded at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nobody was hurt. But now when I make a mistake, I might look foolish, but nobody's going to die. Empirical studies over the years have really backed up what Kaplan and his followers seem to be saying. Studies from Canada, the US, I was a part of this one in 2010, where researchers hand out surveys and ask policymakers, do you use research? How do you use it? And a lot of the time they reply, well, we don't really use it that much. It's not really that important. We've got other sources of information that are more accessible, more relevant, answer questions that we're asking, deliver more timely results. So we don't really use academic research all that much. So there is sort of an empirical basis, but many of these surveys are incomplete and didn't really ask the kinds of the nitty-gritty kinds of questions that I think would give us a better understanding of this topic, which is what we did here. In any case, and I'll talk about this survey in a minute, but just as a prelude to this, there are plenty of good reasons why we should doubt the two communities approach. Mostly because, in my opinion, because all of the studies that have been done, all of the empirical studies that have been done, yes, on average, and even in majority, they say policymakers are not using research, but there's always a significant minority of respondents that say, yeah, we use research all the time and we love it. So somebody's using it in the policymaking field. So two communities evokes an image of sort of isolated, homogeneous groups, and I really don't think that that's the correct way to look at what's happening here. Research use is historically documented. There are lots of cases where policies have been made based on academic research for whatever way you want to imagine usage happens. It does happen. And then I like this interpretation also, that formulating the concept as two separate communities already biases you towards thinking about non-use. We should think about how the two groups can be brought closer together. And then lastly, and I think maybe most importantly, is that the policy community itself, so if these are actually isolated homogeneous groups, the policy community is not really well defined. We talk about government, we talk about policymakers, but who are policymakers? Are they bureaucrats in particular? Are they part of the political executive? We all know that governments and members of parliament and prime ministers and so on make policy, but then the bureaucracy is tasked with formulating, policy programs and implementing policies, and they often make major decisions as well. But these are two very different groups with their own separate sets of. Come in.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right.
Josh, I want to listen.
These are separate groups with their own sets of incentives and rewards and different languages and different timelines and all kinds of other divisions that make this, formulating this as a solitary policy community a little bit problematic. Right. So that got me thinking that maybe two communities is not a good way to look at it. Now, so we did a survey. I say we, but actually I was not here when the survey was conducted, so this is a bit of a caveat here. I arrived in September 2013. Nearly all of the empirical data had been collected at this point, so I can answer some questions, but anything really in-depth about methodology, I might have to pass on to Brian and Michelle and other people who might be better at answering that. But what was done was that was an electronic survey was sent out to policy-related public servants in human services organizations in the 3 biggest states and the federal government. And we got 2,000 replies, and we also did 126 semi-structured 1-hour interviews with very senior managers in the bureaucracy in all 4 of those governments. Some things to remember is that this is not a probability sample. It's conducted more like a census. What happened is that these surveys were sent out to as many people as possible that fit the bill of policy workers in these organizations. They were not compelled by any means to complete the survey, so there's a bit of a self-selection issue. Although, when we look at the results, you'll see that they still said that academic research was, well, still on average, many of them said that they didn't use academic research, and you would suspect that if self-selection were a problem, that people who were interested in academic research would be more likely to fill out the survey, so it doesn't appear that self-selection bias was a serious problem here. Calculating the response rate is going to be extremely difficult because the team didn't have access to all of the contact information for all of the potential respondents. What happened instead was that the people who run these organizations collaborated and distributed the survey internally. So, and that's done because the bureaucracy in general is meant to be protected by anonymity. And so this in general is it's an institution that is designed structurally to prevent people from asking individuals particular questions and identifying them. So I think that, and if you look at other surveys that have been done in the past, this is the methodology that seems to have stuck, and perhaps we can improve on it in the future, but at the moment it seems like this is the best way to go. Okay, so we asked them questions about, as I said before, do you use academic research? How do you use it? What do you use it for? And so on. In general, it looks like having access to academic research doesn't appear to be a problem. So, for instance, nearly 60% said that in addition to using Google, they also use electronic bibliographic databases such as Google Scholar and so on. How often do you experience difficulties in accessing full-text versions of academic articles and reports? The average was about sometimes. And then if you look at the breakdown, you'll see that about 70% said sometimes or never. So generally, it looks like they're not really having a problem getting academic research. Within the past 12 months, have you written one or more documents that draw on academic research? 60% say yes, they have. To what level of depth did they use it? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But first, superficially, it looks like they're not really having any problems accessing the research. How do they use it is a little trickier. In the last 12 months, I've used journal articles and books produced by academics to understand policies and programs in my field. We get a mean of about occasionally, so not that enthusiastic. Drawing on your experience concerning the use of research, please indicate your opinion regarding the following statements. I receive university research that is relevant to my work, sometimes, so it's not given to them necessarily. That says more, I guess, about the organization's priorities than it does about the individual. I have cited university research studies in my own professional reports, again, sometimes. I have adapted the findings of university research to provide information useful to policy decision making. I think probably this is the most important question for this study. Do they actually read the material and then use the information and adapt it for policy advice? Sometimes. So they've got the information, they don't appear to be using it in that much depth on average. Interview responses were all across the board, and that corroborates, I think, the statistical information. So we had some negative responses about research. Trying to get relatively quick analysis through an academic environment is difficult because their timetabling and demands don't meet yours. It's the classic, academics take forever to give you responses. If academics say, well, how do we improve the hospital system? We'll give you what we think in 2 years' time. Well, who gives a damn, basically? They're not part of the game. So pretty negative responses. We had some positive ones. We looked to universities to produce some of the more rigorous evidence, and we commission and contract out work. Universities are on our research panels that we use, and they're often some of the leaders that are of the work that is done in this space. So there were definitely some positive responses as well. Some of them, and I would say most of them, were pretty neutral. A lot of them took sort of a long-term future approach that maybe the situation is not so good now, but there is a lot of potential for collaboration in the future. So, for instance, we used to fund research, but then not use the research because it wasn't useful. What that does then, particularly in times like now, is cause the potential to cut off the possibility of research at all. I think that's a very bad outcome. So, it's not being used maybe, but it could be used in the future if we did the right things, which is still a question mark. But the respondents also had some very interesting ideas about the policy process in general that might shed more light on why they don't use research in the depth that some people might like to see. Responding to urgent day-to-day issues, for instance, takes precedence over long-term thinking. What do you think about that? Well, the average was agreed. So maybe they're forced to deal with very short-term deadlines, and that impedes conceptual use of academic ideas. Policymaking is driven by budgetary considerations, also agree. Policy decisions are based on what is politically acceptable, also agree. We got a lot of responses like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Research-based analysis is valued by decision makers. A little less than agree, not so great. So maybe there are some institutional factors, organizational factors. There is very little benefit in using research to inform policy-related decisions because heads of departments and their advisors just ignore it. This one was closer, well, between neutral and disagree. So this is very interesting because they say that political factors are very important, but that higher-ups inside their own internal bureaucratic institutions may not play by the same rules as politicians. So that gives us more thinking about the differences between the administrative sphere and the political one. But I'll get to that again later. Right. So some respondents talked about in more depth about these kinds of dynamics. Sometimes where the research or evidence comes and doesn't support policy decisions, there's a tendency to try and bury it and pretend we never saw it. It's not evidence-based policy, it's policy-based evidence. This is what we're going to do. Go find something that can be made to sound like it supports this. Right. So, just looking at the results of the survey material, I think that preliminarily we might say that two communities is probably not a very good way to conceptualize what's going on here. Primarily because there are policymakers in all of these questions. None of them were 99% and 1%, as the highest was 70%, 30%. There's still some core minority that say, yes, we do like research, we do use research, we use it all the time, we adapt it, and it informs our policy advice. And that was reflected both in the interview results and in the survey results. So thinking about these as two homogeneous, isolated communities that don't communicate is probably not the right way to go about it. In addition, within those groups, there's a spectrum. Some people answered never, some people answered always, some people sometimes, and so on. So it really wasn't as polarized as the original two communities thesis might lead us to believe. And lastly, there's that difference between the administrative sphere and the political sphere, which I think is not adequately accounted for in academic research at this point. Okay, well that got me thinking further. And what I wanted to do from that point onwards was to divide the people who answered, yes, we love research, and the people who said, no, we hate research, we never use it, and look at their personal and professional characteristics and find out, is there actually anything different between these two internal communities inside the policy sphere? So I looked at these two questions here. In the last 12 months, I've used journal articles and books produced by academics to understand policies and programs in my field. You get 67% that say not frequently, and then 33% that say frequently. So in majority, people are saying they don't really do that, but there is still this core minority that does. I have adapted the findings of university research to provide information useful to policy decision making. Again, 70%, 30%, just about. Right. So there is a division here between what I see as research users and research non-users within the policy making sphere. We asked them some detailed questions about themselves, their gender, their age, years of work experience, where they may have worked before, education, location, policy area, and type of employment. And then what I did was I did some significance testing of the two groups based on their responses, just very simple stuff, difference of proportions or chi-square depending on what was required by the sample. And I found some very interesting results here. So the gender result was significant, and again, this is not a probability sample, so we should really think about this as people who are willing to answer a survey on academic research use. But what I found here was that gender was a significant result, but it wasn't really a practically significant result. The sample in general was mostly female, and what I found here was that research users tended to be more likely to be female than the rest of the group, and I'm not sure what to make of that. So that might be a topic for a greater discussion. Age, not significant, and years of work experience, not significant, which I think means, well, not significant at the 95%, which I think may indicate that there isn't a generational effect going on here, that this is probably something that spans the whole length of time of interest in research utilization. So it's not like older people use research more or younger people use research more or whatever. Previous work experience was significant, so where did you have your previous job? Highest level of education. Location was significant in that there was sort of 3 percentage points more likely to be from the federal government. Again, statistically significant. Not sure what the practical significance of that is. It's sort of a small difference. Policy area was significant, and job position was significant in that there was one category that was slightly more likely. Data analyst was slightly less likely to use research, and again, not sure what to make of it, but again, the difference is really small, like 1 percentage point. So not sure if there's much we can say about those ones. What we can say, I think, something interesting about it is the 3 that I mentioned that were important. This one here, level of education. So these are all of the research users, the people that answered, yes, I adapt academic research for crafting policy advice, and these are the people that said, no, I don't do it frequently. And you'll find that people who like to use research, unsurprisingly, are more likely to have postgraduate degrees. In fact, all of the categories of education were better represented by non-research users except postgraduate degrees. Also, more than half of the research users said that they had a postgraduate degree. I think that there might be something going on here. This one is previous work experience, and you see sort of a similar phenomenon happening here, but in reverse. People who worked in the private sector before they worked in government are more likely to identify as research non-users, whereas people who worked in the university sector are more likely to identify as being a research user. Same for nonprofit organizations. So it seems that people who have worked in the university sector before or in the nonprofit sector before, or some combination of those, are more likely to say they use academic research, whereas people who worked in the private sector or who had no previous job experience at all were more likely to say that they don't use academic research. And then policy area, social policy, definitely better represented in the research user area, economics and health better represented over here. We might question why health ended up in the non-research using category, but we have to remember that this was specifically about academic research, and the health area, they probably use a lot more contract research and private sector research, so that might account for that. So in general, education and social policy areas, people who worked in those areas said that they use research more. So, what can we conclude here? Well, it seems that in this survey, just like in previous studies, yes, the majority of respondents said they don't use academic research all that much, but there was a core minority of people who said that they do, and they do a lot. But those people tend to be better trained in terms of education. They tend to work in sort of softer policy areas like social policy and education rather than economics. And they tend to have work experience in the university sector or the nonprofit sector. So it kind of looks like people who use academic research in the policy area look more like academics. So rather than two communities, there might be a lot of opportunity for connections between the two groups if we can acknowledge that there are actually structural similarities between these two groups. Are there actually two communities within the public service, research using policymakers and research non-using policymakers? Well, probably not really, and also probably for the same reasons, because even though 53% of research users have postgraduate degrees, there are still some that have high school and that's all. So there's still a spectrum, no matter which way you look at it, no matter how you slice these data, you're going to find that you can't get it down to an irreducible component. So what I would tend to suggest is that instead of looking at two communities, we're actually looking at sort of a spectrum of academic research use, and that people who tend to have more university contact in terms of education or work experience tend to be more towards the research using end, whereas people who have more private sector and less education experience tend to be more towards the research non-using end. So I think looking at it as in terms of solitary communities is probably the wrong way